I'm speaking from Australia, from Toby's hometown. And we've recently had studies in Australia which say actually in Australia there's quite low trust in AI. I'll be less feisty than Toby, but probably singing from a similar playbook. Low trust in AI, we think, is not necessarily a bad thing. We think that probably people should be demanding that AI or those deploying AI should be proving that it is trustworthy rather than being asked to trust in a technology that they perhaps don't have access to or have poor understanding of. So the trust point for us is not necessary, or from my perspective, is not necessarily problematic, but there are other issues that we would need to address, which do go to the standards question. In Australia, we don't have an umbrella AI Act, but what we have is and we have voluntary AI safety standards, which I think, as Ansgar mentioned earlier, the beauty of sort of safety standards is they can feed into the ISO standards. So there's a more general standards, and then people can go and find the detail in the ISO standard. And I think that's worked very well in Australia. We also, as Toby mentioned, have lots of specific legislation, which is either directed at technology, so that's our eSafety Act. We also have a Scam Prevention Act. And then we have lots of jurisdictional regulators, so regulators for workplace safety, regulators for the environment, regulators for consumer protection, financial services. And I think Ansgar also mentioned, I think it was him, that, we're a single country, so different from Europe in that basis, because our regulators do, I think, a pretty good job. And we just need that feed through of, I think, expertise and power to them to have this confidence in that AI is human-centered and human rights-centered and so on. But excitingly, and Toby didn't mention it, so it was nice of him. Yesterday, our government announced the AI plan for Australia, which I think is sort of useful to mention because it has a lot of similarities for what's happening in our region. And our region is kind of the region that's not the US, it's not Africa, it's not China, and it's not Europe. There's this other little region down here, which is probably I think we'd call it the Asia Pacific region, where there's a lot of diversity, both in culture and values, and also in economic development. So Australian government's announced the AI plan, which will include an AI Safety Institute, which was a commitment from Bletchley and then from Korea. Build AI infrastructure, consult with workers and unions and individuals, which I think was a theme that came up earlier, scale our training, and importantly, ensure that the benefits of the technology as well as the literacy is equitably shared. And that's the thing, that equitable sharing goes to point 4 that we were asked to or point 4, I think it was, that we were asked to discuss, or point 3, can't remember. One of the points we were asked to discuss was the equitable sharing. And our government's made a commitment to that. That's important because Australia is a very empty country, actually. We have a small population, given the size of the country. So a lot of the issues for Australia is we have regional populations that don't have internet connectivity, let alone access to the advances or limitations of AI, depending on how skeptical you want to be. So a government commitment to extend the benefits of technology to rural areas. And that's what really resonates with the area, with the region, I think, as well. Because in our region, we have the economic powerhouse of Singapore, but we also have countries that are some of the poorest countries in the world. Cambodia, Laos, who are sort of still recovering from wars in earlier times that were colonial wars, to be honest. So the focus on the region, I think, will be very important for Australia. And ensuring that perhaps that it's not just a AI race where some countries get to choose whether we use it and other countries don't get access at all. And I think, at least in my view, Toby's mentioned the environmental challenge. For me, there's also the challenge of how we work with our region in ensuring that AI governance is robust and culturally resonant. And I think standards as well as intergovernmental agreements, and just respectful cultural discussions have a role to play there. And that's really all I need to say.
Thanks very much, Jeannie. I don't want to get into a constitutional debate on Australia, but what would happen if, in the one country that is Australia, a state decided that it wanted to have a different policy on police use of AI-enabled tools because that was important for the people of the state? I mean, isn't it true that at any level in any wonderful constitution, you face a risk of that sort of conflict of competences?
Yes, but generally there is a risk that the states in Australia might decide they need to take a different approach. Um, the bottom line is that most of the rulemaking powers sit with our federal government. So the federal government, the Commonwealth government can actually just write a law that overrides the state's decisions on almost all matters, except, and this is the important one, education. Education, you're right, is state-based, Robert. And I think that that will be really interesting to see what happens there because, of course, we know that education is fundamental. And on the one hand, there are the concerns about the whether too widespread use of generative AI in schools is going to, fundamentally impede learning and educational growth of our children. And on the other hand, children and young people are moving into a technology-enabled world. So some familiarity with technology will be important. So yes, you could see that happening in education, but in most other fields, the Commonwealth has the power. Probably the bigger issue for Australia is the one that I mentioned, which is just we have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are asking for and deserves data sovereignty and to be included in conversations about how AI is deployed. And we also have regional communities who I mentioned still do not have connection to the technology. Colleagues of mine have recently done a report on the AI divide, and it is quite considerable in even a relatively wealthy country like Australia because largely our geographical challenges and probably a history, or not probably, and also a history of sort of colonialism have created disparities in access and wealth. So I think that for us, those and the environmental challenges Toby mentioned are very significant. And then there are the sort of regional issues of how do we work with our Pacific Island neighbours, how do we work with our ASEAN neighbours, given, again, quite disparate access to technology.
The other question, Jeannie, I wanted to ask you to comment on, and then we have one more ad hoc speaker to announce, and then we open the floor, is the point you made right at the beginning about the sort of bootstrapping of your territorial governance through voluntary standards. And can you say a bit more? Because did that get you faster to market? I can well imagine it did.
So Australia has quite an interesting legal structure in that we rely a lot. Somebody talked about sandboxes earlier. So Australia's law is a lot of Australia's laws written as standards or principles. So they're quite flexible and adaptive, which means that the idea is that they can change to accommodate new technologies. The issue there is what is the requirement? What's the content of those laws? For example, financial service providers, such as banks, have to act in a way that's efficient, honest, and fair. And the view is that that means that before they deploy technologies that have an impact on customers, they have to have done pretty much the kind of governance steps that a number of people have standards of having comprehensively tested the technology, having and continuing to test the technology, having complaint mechanisms, have transparency, and so on. The view is that the voluntary standards are voluntary, but if the financial services regulator says this is our expectation about what you will do, if you are deploying technologies in what effectively are the high-risk contexts mentioned in the EU AI Act, that those voluntary standards are only voluntary in name in the sense that they set the baseline expectation for how businesses will operate. So it's people have mentioned it before. It's this kind of feed up mechanism where we have broad, open-ended laws, and the content of the laws is informed by the standards. And our regulators often do sandbox new innovation. The issue for Australia is actually probably that is in fact probably questions of control over the technology. There's a big debate at the moment about who should develop the technology, what sort of models should we have. The questions Toby mentioned, and we have a commitment to building the infrastructure from our government, but there's a great deal of concern about how that is funded, how it develops, what benefit comes back to communities that have data centres, in their backyard.